The final days of May 1944 brought thick morning fog to the Norman coast. Oberleutnant Frido Eberling positioned himself at the western rim of the concrete observation post. His binoculars swept across the jagged limestone precipice that dropped straight down into the churning waters below. 100 feet of vertical rock face separated his position from the narrow strip of sand at the waterline. Dense mist rolled across the English Channel like a gray blanket. Somewhere beyond that wall of fog, Allied invasion fleets waited in the darkness. Behind him, young artillerymen from the coastal battery moved through their daily routines. These boys had complete faith in the fortress they occupied. Eberling lowered his field glasses. A thin smile crossed his weathered face. No assault force could possibly scale these sheer walls while under constant fire. The position stood as an impenetrable barrier against seaborne attack. Any American foolish enough to attempt a landing here would meet death on the jagged rocks far below. The mathematical certainty of German victory at this cliff-top stronghold was carved not in tactical manuals, but in the brutal physics of vertical warfare. 100 feet of perpendicular stone face dominated by interlocking machine gun positions. 200 veteran soldiers from elite coastal divisions held this ground. Extensive minefields and razor wire barriers protected every inland approach. Each calculation confirmed what seemed obvious to anyone standing atop these towering cliffs. This position could never fall to naval assault. Yet within days that mathematical certainty would clash head-on with American determination. The result would be one of the most daring vertical assaults in the history of warfare. A battle that would shatter every assumption about the limits of human courage and tactical innovation. German confidence in this position had developed over years of careful preparation. On June 10, 1940, immediately following France's collapse, Wehrmacht engineers conducted their first survey of this commanding promontory. The rocky point jutted boldly into the English Channel. It sat directly between the beaches that would eventually be designated Utah and Omaha. A natural citadel with unobstructed fields of fire stretching more than 12 miles in every direction. From this elevated position, heavy coastal artillery could deliver devastating fire against any amphibious landing within range. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel received appointment as Inspector General of Atlantic Wall Defenses in late 1943. He personally examined this cliff-top fortress on March 11, 1944. His private diary, discovered in German military archives 30 years later, recorded his professional assessment with typical Germanic precision. These cliffs provide natural defensive advantages, superior to any fortification human engineering could construct. Enemy assault from the sea represents a tactical impossibility. Our primary concern must focus on defending against airborne insertion or attacks from inland positions. 6 captured French 155mm guns had been positioned atop the promontory by late 1942. Each massive artillery piece possessed the capability to hurl a 95-pound explosive shell across approximately 20,000 yards of open water. 4 guns occupied open concrete emplacements. 2 additional weapons were being enclosed within massive reinforced concrete bunkers. These structures were specifically designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest naval gunfire and sustained aerial bombardment. The scale of construction alone demonstrated absolute German confidence in holding this position indefinitely. By spring 1944, this cliff-top complex had evolved into a fortress that seemed to validate every assumption about its absolute impregnability. The defensive installation included a massive concrete observation bunker providing panoramic surveillance of the invasion beaches. Multiple positions for 20mm anti-aircraft weapons dotted the perimeter. 30 separate anti-aircraft guns protected the position from air attack. Interconnected trenches and underground tunnels created a network of protected movement routes. Ammunition storage bunkers had been carved directly into the cliff face itself. Extensive minefields covered every conceivable approach route from inland directions. The garrison consisted of approximately 125 seasoned infantry soldiers from the 726th Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Infantry Division. 85 specialized artillerymen from the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260 manned the heavy guns. Additional support elements from the 352nd Infantry Division maintained positions in reserve just behind the main defensive line. One Gefreiter assigned to defend the eastern approaches wrote to his wife on May 28, 1944. His letter reflected the absolute confidence shared throughout the garrison. "We occupy the finest defensive position along the entire Atlantic Wall. Let the Americans attempt an assault if they possess such foolish courage. They will discover nothing except death waiting on our cliffs. Every soldier here understands these rocks constitute our fortress. No enemy force can possibly climb them while under our concentrated fire." The tactical mathematics appeared absolutely unassailable to German planners. Allied forces attempting to scale the cliff face would remain exposed to defensive fire for a minimum of 15 minutes. More likely, 30 minutes or longer if climbing ropes failed or men lost their grip on wet rock. Throughout that extended period, defenders positioned along the cliff edge could deliver direct plunging fire upon climbers who possessed no cover, no ability to maneuver, and extremely limited capacity to return effective fire. German defensive doctrine called for machine gun positions spaced at intervals of 75 meters along the entire cliff edge. This spacing ensured overlapping fields of fire that eliminated any dead ground or covered approaches. Stick grenades could simply be tossed over the edge like deadly raindrops. Even loose rocks pushed from the cliff top would transform into lethal projectiles during their 100-foot fall. One Wehrmacht tactical manual calculated that a single motivated defender could kill or wound 10 attackers during such an exposed vertical assault. This meant the 200-man garrison could theoretically inflict over 2,000 casualties before being overwhelmed through sheer numbers. Such casualty projections made any assault appear prohibitively costly. But across the dark waters of the English Channel, military planners were conducting very different calculations. In the heavily secured planning facilities of Allied Supreme Headquarters in London, Operation Overlord was taking its final shape. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, and his senior staff had identified this clifftop position as one of the most dangerous German defensive installations along the entire Normandy coastline. Those 6 155mm guns, if they remained operational when D-Day commenced, could rain devastating destruction upon both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. A single battery firing with trained accuracy could sink dozens of landing craft, destroy armored vehicles before they cleared the waterline, and transform the narrow invasion beaches into impassable killing grounds. The mathematics of successful invasion demanded the complete elimination of these guns before the main beach landings began. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army and bearing responsibility for the American landing sectors, faced a decision that would haunt his conscience for decades. The cliffs rose too high and were too heavily defended for any conventional infantry assault. Paratroopers could theoretically be dropped behind the position to attack from inland, but the dense terrain of Norman hedgerow country made that approach uncertain at best. Heavy naval gunfire and concentrated aerial bombardment might damage the installation, but massive concrete bunkers were specifically designed to survive such attacks. Only one tactical option offered reasonable certainty of mission success: but it appeared to violate every established principle of sound military tactics. A small specialized force would have to land at the base of the sheer cliffs, scale them while under intense enemy fire, and destroy the guns through direct close combat action. When Bradley explained this mission requirement to Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder on February 3, 1944, the general's discomfort was immediately obvious. Rudder, a 34-year-old reserve officer from Brady, Texas, commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion. This elite unit of 545 specially trained men had been formed specifically for the most difficult and dangerous missions. Bradley looked across the map-covered table at the young officer and voiced what both men were thinking. This could represent the most dangerous mission assignment of the entire invasion operation. Navy planners are telling me the assault cannot be accomplished. One senior officer even suggested that 3 elderly women armed with brooms could prevent the Rangers from climbing those cliffs. Rudder studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across the conference table. Aerial images revealed the stark vertical walls rising from the narrow beach. He noted the gun emplacements, the concrete observation bunker, the defensive positions scattered along the cliff edge like deadly sentinels. Then he raised his eyes to meet Bradley's worried gaze and spoke words that would echo through military history for generations. "My men can accomplish this mission, sir. Give us the assignment, and we will deliver results." The planning process that followed proved as unprecedented as the mission itself. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, totaling 225 carefully selected men, would form the primary assault force designated Force A. They would be supported by the 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider. This secondary force, designated Force C, would follow closely behind to reinforce success or divert to Omaha Beach if the cliff assault failed completely. The landing was scheduled for 0630 hours on D-Day, designated H hour for this specific operation. Naval gunfire support would be provided by the battleship USS Texas and destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Talibant. But the central challenge that obsessed Rudder and his planning staff remained elegantly simple and seemingly insurmountable. How does any military force climb 100 feet of vertical cliff face, while enemy soldiers above are systematically trying to kill every climber? The Rangers began intensive specialized training in April 1944 on similar cliffs near Swanage on the southern coast of England. British commandos, battle-hardened veterans of coastal raids against German positions in Norway and France, shared their hard-earned expertise in cliff assault techniques and equipment. The commandos possessed extensive experience in vertical warfare, but they maintained brutal honesty about the inherent challenges. Climbing under enemy fire bears no resemblance to recreational mountain climbing, Captain David Niven of the British Commandos told a group of Rangers during an early training session. "Your primary enemy is not the rock face itself, but the determined soldier at the top who is concentrating his entire effort on killing you. Speed becomes your only possible defense." Even maximum speed may prove insufficient. The Rangers systematically tested every conceivable climbing method and technique. They developed rocket-propelled grappling hooks as their primary innovation. A small rocket motor attached to a steel grapple and climbing rope could be fired from a handheld launcher. The rocket would send the grappling hook arcing over the cliff edge, where it would catch on rocks, concrete obstacles, or defensive structures. Multiple ropes would create an interconnected network of climbing lines across the entire cliff face. Throughout April and May 1944, the Rangers practiced their vertical assault on the Swanage Cliffs dozens of times under increasingly realistic conditions. First Sergeant Leonard Lomel, a 24-year-old from Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, commanded D Company's 2nd Platoon. He recorded the evolution of their technique in letters home to his family. We have climbed these cliffs so many times that I dream about ropes and rocks every night, he wrote on April 23rd. Today we attempted the climb using wet ropes because ours will be completely soaked with seawater during the actual assault. Wet ropes prove slippery as ice, and 2 men fell during practice, though neither suffered serious injury. Tomorrow we practice carrying full combat loads of 60 pounds, including weapons and ammunition. The Rangers gradually developed a sophisticated technique of team climbing. One man would ascend rapidly carrying only light equipment like a pistol or carbine. His mission focused on establishing a fighting position at the cliff top to provide covering fire for subsequent climbers. Other Rangers would follow carrying heavier weapons and equipment. The strongest climbers were assigned to carry Browning automatic rifles and additional ammunition loads. Each company received 10 thermite grenades for the mission. These special incendiary devices burned at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That intense heat could melt gun mechanisms completely and weld steel components together permanently, ensuring that captured artillery pieces could never be restored to operational status. Colonel Rudder addressed the fundamental challenges directly in his final briefing on June 4, 1944. The Rangers assembled for embarkation and the journey across the English Channel. His words carried the weight of absolute honesty about what lay ahead. Gentlemen, I will not lie to any of you about the nature of what we face tomorrow morning. The German defenders will possess every conceivable tactical advantage. They will occupy elevated positions behind prepared cover with clear, unobstructed fields of fire down upon our assault. We will be completely exposed on climbing ropes, carrying heavy combat loads, with absolutely no place to find cover or concealment. Some of us will not reach the cliff top alive. Some of us will not survive the day ahead. But I know this fact with absolute certainty. If any fighting force on Earth possesses the capability to take this objective, it is this battalion. We have trained for this specific mission for 3 solid months. We know the terrain, we know our weapons, and most importantly, we know each other. When we land on that narrow beach, we will climb those cliffs faster than the German defenders believe humanly possible. We will reach the cliff top before they can kill us all. And when we reach the top, we will complete our assigned mission without fail. Those guns will be destroyed completely. The invasion will succeed. Are you with me? The response from 225 throats came instantly and with absolute conviction. Rangers lead the way, sir. The journey across the dark waters of the English Channel began at 0445 hours on June 6, 1944. Rangers boarded their landing craft assault vessels from the troop transport HMS Amsterdam in complete darkness and increasingly rough seas. Each LCA carried 22 fully equipped men. 9 LCA craft transported the assault force, with 2 additional vessels carrying specialized supplies and equipment. 4 DUKW amphibious trucks mounted 100-foot extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. The seas proved far rougher than any training exercise had prepared them for. Waves reached 5 to 6 feet in height. Several Rangers became violently seasick in the crowded, heaving landing craft. Salt spray crashed over the low sides continuously, soaking every man to the skin before they had traveled 10 minutes from the mothership. Private First Class Harry Fate, a rifleman in E Company, later described the nightmarish journey in vivid detail. We were completely soaked before we had traveled 10 minutes from the ship. Seawater spray washed continuously over the low sides of the LCA. Men vomited repeatedly, while others bailed water desperately to prevent us from swamping completely. Around us in the darkness moved thousands of ships, forming the greatest armada in human history. At 0550 hours, as the first pale light touched the eastern sky, the naval bombardment of the clifftop position began with earth-shaking violence. USS Texas, a massive battleship mounting 10 14-inch guns, opened fire from a position 10,000 yards offshore. The enormous shells, each weighing 1,400 pounds, screamed overhead with the sound of express trains. They impacted the clifftop with explosions that shook the earth for miles around. In exactly 34 minutes, USS Texas fired 255 rounds of 14-inch shells at the target, averaging 7.5 shells per minute, in a sustained barrage of unprecedented intensity. The destroyers Satterlee and Talibant added their 5-inch guns to the devastating bombardment. The Rangers, struggling through rough seas in their crowded landing craft, could see the clifftop erupting in towering fountains of earth and concrete debris. Smoke and dust clouds rose hundreds of feet into the morning air. But the first critical error of the assault was already unfolding in the darkness and confusion of the Channel crossing. Lieutenant Colin Beaver, of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, commanded the lead motor launch responsible for guiding the entire assault force to the correct landing point. In the darkness, rough seas, and confusion of thousands of vessels, he had navigated incorrectly. Instead of heading directly toward the target, the flotilla was traveling parallel to the Norman coast toward Point de la Percée, approximately 3 miles to the east of their actual objective. First Sergeant Lomel was among the first to notice the navigation error. Looking through the salt spray at the cliffs ahead, he observed the wrong configuration of rock formations and defensive positions. He scrambled across the crowded LCA to reach the British coxswain at the boat's controls. "That's not our target," Lomel shouted over the roar of engines and crashing waves. "We are completely off course and heading toward the wrong cliffs." Eventually, as the error became obvious to other experienced rangers as well, Lieutenant Beaver acknowledged the serious mistake and ordered an immediate course correction. But precious time had been irretrievably lost. The assault, originally scheduled for H-hour at 0630, would not reach the beach until well after 700 hours. This 40-minute delay meant the Rangers would conduct their climb in full daylight rather than the relative concealment of dawn shadows. Even more critically, 40 minutes after the naval bombardment ended, German defenders would have sufficient time to recover from the stunning effects and man their defensive positions with restored effectiveness. Company C of the 2nd Rangers, which had been assigned to assault Point de la Percée as a separate objective, landed correctly at their designated target at approximately 0640 hours. Captain Ralph Goranson led 70 men up those cliffs and successfully seized their objective. But they were now separated from the main assault force by 3 miles of enemy-held coastline with no possibility of mutual support. Meanwhile, Force C Rangers of the 5th Ranger Battalion waited offshore for the radio signal confirming that the main objective had been captured. Following their contingency orders exactly, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider made the painful decision to divert his 500 men to Omaha Beach. The plan had called for his battalion to reinforce success at the cliffs. But the 40-minute delay meant they would instead land at Omaha Beach's Dog White sector, where they would fight a completely different battle that may have been decisive in the eventual breakthrough at that bloodiest of all landing beaches. This meant the 225 men of Force A would assault the clifftop fortress entirely alone, without the planned reinforcement that might mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. At 0710 hours, the landing craft carrying Force A finally turned toward the correct objective after the navigation error had been resolved. The towering cliffs rose before them like a stone wall, stark and vertical in the bright morning light. Their faces were pockmarked and cratered from the massive naval bombardment. Smoke still drifted upward from shattered bunkers at the cliff top. The narrow strip of beach at the cliff base, perhaps 30 yards wide at low tide, was littered with bomb craters and fallen rocks from the bombardment. Above this scene, the cliff face rose straight upward for 100 feet of limestone and chalk, an almost perfectly vertical barrier that seemed to mock human ambition. The first LCA, number 888 carrying Colonel Rudder and elements of E Company, ground onto the rocky beach with a grinding scrape of metal on stone. The ramp splashed down into knee-deep water. Rudder was the first man off the landing craft, running toward the cliff base through an immediate hail of machine gun fire that erupted from hidden positions along the cliff edge. The German defenders had recovered from the bombardment far faster than Allied intelligence had predicted. They were alive, alert, and ready for battle. Their response was immediate and devastating. The two soldiers advanced using their practiced leapfrog method. One man would surge forward while his partner provided covering fire from behind. Each movement was calculated and deliberate. They had covered roughly 250 yards when they moved beyond the coastal highway heading south. Suddenly, Lamel froze in position. His body went rigid with tension. Through a narrow opening in the thick hedgerow, he had spotted something that made his pulse quicken. He swiveled toward Cohen. His voice dropped to an urgent half-whisper. The words he spoke would echo through Ranger legend for generations to come. "Jack, here they are. We've found them. Here are the goddamned guns." Beyond the hedge lay an orchard, bathed in dappled sunlight. Camouflage netting stretched between the trees like giant spider webs. Beneath this concealment sat 5 massive 155 Fjapkintthbemi howitzers. The missing artillery pieces they had climbed these cliffs to find. The guns were arranged in perfect battery formation. Each barrel pointed northwest with deadly precision toward Utah Beach. Mountains of ammunition shells were stacked beside each weapon like deadly pyramids. The brass casings gleamed dully in the filtered light. What struck Lamel as almost unbelievable was the complete absence of German soldiers near the guns themselves. The artillery pieces sat unguarded and vulnerable. About 100 meters across an open meadow, he could make out approximately 100 German soldiers. They appeared to be artillerymen and guards assembled in some kind of military formation. These enemy troops had absolutely no idea that 2 American Rangers crouched within grenade, throwing distance of their prized artillery. Lamel's tactical mind processed the situation with lightning speed. He and Cohen each carried exactly 1 thermite grenade. 2 grenades would not be sufficient to destroy 5 massive howitzers completely. But they could not afford to wait for reinforcements. Each passing minute increased the deadly possibility that these guns would swing into action against the vulnerable landing beaches. American soldiers were dying on those beaches right now. These weapons could multiply that carnage exponentially. Lamel turned back to his partner with grim determination. "Give me your grenade, Jack. Cover me. I'm going to fix them." Cohen dropped into a defensive crouch. His Thompson submachine gun was ready for action. Lamel began his dangerous crawl toward the first artillery piece. Every movement had to be silent and calculated. The soft earth muffled his approach. He reached the first howitzer and located the recoil mechanism. This complex mechanical assembly absorbed the tremendous shock generated when the gun fired. It was the weapon's most vulnerable component. Lamel carefully positioned his thermite grenade within the intricate machinery. His fingers found the pin and pulled it free. The thermite grenade ignited without sound or flash. The chemical reaction began immediately. The temperature soared beyond 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Molten metal began flowing like liquid fire through every crevice of the mechanism. Moving gears welded themselves together permanently. Precision components fused into a solid and completely useless mass of twisted metal. Lamel moved swiftly to the second gun. He placed Cohen's grenade deep within the traversing mechanism that allowed the weapon to rotate and target different areas. The pin came out with a soft, metallic click. Again, the silent thermite reaction began its destructive work. With both grenades now expended, Lamel stripped off his field jacket. He wrapped the heavy cloth around the wooden stock of his Thompson submachine gun. This improvised club became his weapon for the next phase of sabotage. He moved systematically from gun to gun, smashing the delicate optical sights with methodical precision. These precision instruments were impossible to replace in battlefield conditions. Without functioning sights, the guns could not be aimed with any accuracy. They would be reduced to firing blindly if the Germans attempted to use them at all. The entire sabotage operation consumed less than 10 minutes of precious time. Lamel and Cohen then withdrew as silently as ghosts. They retraced their path through the hedgerows without detection. Their movements were as careful and deliberate as their initial approach had been. However, the mission remained incomplete in Lamel's mind. 3 guns had been damaged, but not destroyed beyond all possibility of repair. German engineers might be able to restore at least some functionality to the weapons. This risk was unacceptable, given what was at stake. The 2 Rangers reached their roadblock position, where other Rangers maintained their defensive positions. Lamel immediately began collecting additional thermite grenades from his fellow soldiers. Most Rangers had not yet used their issued grenades in combat. Within a few minutes, Lamel had filled his field jacket with enough thermite grenades to complete the job properly. He and Cohen immediately began their return journey toward the orchard. The path was now familiar, but remained dangerous. Any German patrol could discover them at any moment. They moved with the same careful precision as before. They reached the gun position again around 9 a.m. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the day was warming noticeably. Incredibly, no German soldiers had yet returned to guard their artillery. The weapons remained as vulnerable as before. This German oversight seemed almost too good to be true. Cohen established his covering position once again. His Thompson was ready to provide suppressing fire if German troops appeared unexpectedly. Lamel moved methodically among the 3 previously damaged guns. He placed thermite grenades strategically throughout each weapon to ensure complete and irreversible destruction. The pins were pulled in rapid succession. Multiple thermite reactions began simultaneously. The chemical fires would burn through every critical component. These artillery pieces would never threaten Allied forces again. Lamel began his withdrawal from the target area. He climbed carefully over the 9-foot hedgerow, where Cohen waited in position. Just as both men cleared the hedge, the entire world seemed to explode around them. A massive detonation erupted with earth-shaking violence. The blast wave threw both Rangers completely off the hedgerow and down into the sunken road below. Debris of every description rained from the sky like a deadly hailstorm. Dirt clods, shell fragments, pieces of equipment, and chunks of concrete fell around them. Both men lay stunned and temporarily deafened by the enormous explosion. Neither Ranger understood what had caused this devastating blast. They had no way of knowing that Sergeant Frank Rupinski was leading a patrol from E Company through the same area. His patrol had discovered a massive German ammunition dump located dangerously close to the gun position. Rupinski had destroyed the ammunition stockpile with grenades. The resulting explosion had been tremendous enough to be heard miles away. The concussion had shattered windows in distant farmhouses. At exactly 9:05 a.m., Lamel dispatched a runner back toward Colonel Rudder's command post. The message this runner carried would determine whether the entire Point du Hoc mission was declared successful or failed. The words were simple but momentous. Located guns. All destroyed. Mission accomplished. Colonel Rudder received this message at his command post, which was under increasingly intense German artillery and mortar fire. He allowed himself one brief moment of satisfaction before the harsh tactical reality of their situation reasserted itself completely. The guns were indeed destroyed. The primary mission had been technically accomplished, but now 175 Rangers found themselves completely isolated on a clifftop position. They were surrounded by German forces of unknown but clearly substantial strength. Their ammunition supplies were dwindling rapidly. No prospect of immediate relief appeared likely. Throughout the long afternoon of June 6th, German counterattacks increased steadily in both frequency and intensity. Elements of the 914th Sanban 914th Grenadier Regiment began probing the Ranger defensive positions with increasing boldness. These attacks tested for weak points and gathered intelligence about Ranger strength. Mortar fire pounded the roadblock positions with methodical precision. The explosions sent fountains of dirt and debris skyward. German snipers established concealed positions throughout the hedgerow network. Their accurate fire made any movement dangerous for the Rangers. The observation bunker at the very tip of Point du Hoc presented a continuing problem. This massive concrete structure had survived the devastating naval bombardment completely intact. German defenders remained inside this fortress, using it as a base for continued resistance. Rangers poured bazooka rounds through the firing slits in the thick concrete walls. Grenades were thrown into every opening they could find. But the Germans inside refused to surrender or abandon their position. The bunker remained a thorn in the Rangers' defensive perimeter. By nightfall on June the 6th, Colonel Rudder faced the most difficult command decision of his entire military career. His original force of 225 men had been reduced by more than one-third through death and wounds. Many of the wounded Rangers continued fighting despite their injuries. Communication with the roadblock force positioned on the coastal highway was becoming increasingly intermittent. Radio contact faded in and out unpredictably. Ammunition stocks were running critically low throughout all positions. Grenades and mortar rounds were especially scarce. The Germans clearly controlled the high ground on three sides of the Ranger positions. Intelligence indicated they were preparing for a major coordinated counterattack. The tactical situation was deteriorating with each passing hour. British Commando Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor had come ashore with the Rangers as an official observer. His assessment of their prospects was delivered with characteristic British understatement. "Never have I been so convinced of anything as that I will be either a prisoner of war or a casualty by morning." The night of June 6th to 7th became a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. German counterattacks developed in successive waves throughout the dark hours. Illumination flares burst overhead, casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. Machine gun tracers crisscrossed the darkness like deadly fireworks. The Rangers were utterly exhausted from the cliff assault and the day's continuous fighting. They took turns standing watch while their comrades tried to rest. Sleep came in brief snatches between enemy attacks. At approximately 11 p.m., a much more serious counterattack developed against the Ranger positions. German infantry, estimated at full company strength, advanced from the south toward the roadblock positions. The attack began with intensive mortar preparation that lasted for 15 minutes. Then came the main assault. German infantry advanced in short, coordinated rushes. They used fire and movement tactics effectively. One group would provide covering fire, while another group bounded forward to new positions. The Rangers met this attack with everything they had remaining. Browning automatic rifles fired in short, carefully controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. M1 Garand rifles cracked steadily from defensive positions. Grenades arced through the darkness toward German positions. The enemy infantry managed to advance to within 50 meters of the Ranger defensive line before their attack finally stalled. The Rangers had held their positions, but the cost had been severe. Another 6 men lay dead in their foxholes. 10 more Rangers were wounded and needed medical attention. Ammunition stocks reached critical levels after this engagement. The 60mm mortars were down to their last few precious rounds. Rifle ammunition was being rationed carefully. June 7th brought renewed German pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Counterattacks developed from the east, south, and west. The Germans were clearly bringing up substantial reinforcements, including fresh elements from the 352nd Infantry Division. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming completely untenable for the isolated Rangers. The roadblock force on the coastal highway now numbered approximately 85 men. This included the 23 Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion who had somehow managed to reach them during the evening of June 6th. This roadblock force was in serious danger of being completely cut off and destroyed. The main command post perimeter on Point du Hoc itself was defending against attacks from the western approaches. This position was down to roughly 90 men, and many of these were wounded. Colonel Rudder himself had been wounded twice during the intense fighting. Despite his injuries, he had to make a crucial tactical decision. Should he consolidate all his remaining forces into a single defensive position on Point du Hoc? Or should he maintain the roadblock on the coastal highway despite the obvious risks? Rudder chose to hold both positions simultaneously. He was gambling that reinforcements would arrive before his isolated companies were completely overrun. This decision reflected both tactical necessity and the fundamental Ranger philosophy. They had been assigned a mission to hold the coastal road. They would maintain that position until relieved or destroyed. The German attacks throughout June 7th were absolutely relentless in their intensity. Machine gun positions that had been bypassed during the initial assault now opened fire from unexpected angles. These weapons created deadly crossfires that trapped Rangers in their foxholes. Snipers seemed to be positioned everywhere throughout the hedgerow network. Their accurate fire made movement between positions extremely hazardous. The Rangers discovered that many German defensive positions were connected by hidden tunnels and communication trenches. This allowed enemy defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts. By the evening of June 7th, the tactical situation had become truly desperate for the Rangers. Ammunition was nearly completely exhausted across all positions. The last 60mm mortar rounds had been fired during the afternoon fighting. Hand grenades were completely gone from most positions. Some Rangers were down to their final clips for their M1 rifles. Water supplies were running dangerously low in the summer heat. Medical supplies had been completely exhausted hours earlier. The wounded lay in crude aid stations, receiving minimal treatment. The night of June 7th to 8th brought the absolute crisis point for the defending Rangers. A coordinated German attack estimated at full battalion strength struck all Ranger positions simultaneously at midnight. This was clearly not another probing attack, but a deliberate assault designed to completely annihilate the Rangers. Artillery preparation pounded the defensive positions for 30 minutes. The bombardment was the heaviest the Rangers had yet experienced. Then came the infantry assault, advancing in mass formation behind the rolling barrage. The Rangers conserved their last precious ammunition by waiting until German soldiers were within 50 meters before opening fire. The volume of defensive fire was initially devastating, but the Germans continued advancing despite heavy casualties. First Sergeant Lommel commanded a section of the roadblock position during this critical engagement. He found himself down to exactly 3 rounds for his Thompson submachine gun and 1 remaining grenade. When German infantry appeared within 20 meters of his position, he fired his last 3 rounds with careful precision. He threw his final grenade into the advancing enemy formation. Then he picked up an M1 rifle from a dead Ranger and continued fighting with renewed determination. Other Rangers were making similar desperate choices throughout the perimeter. The German attack finally broke less than 10 meters from the Ranger defensive positions. The enemy forces had taken murderous casualties during their advance. They withdrew into the darkness, leaving dozens of dead and wounded scattered across the battlefield. The Rangers conducted an ammunition check after this engagement. They discovered they had collectively perhaps 100 rounds remaining for all weapons combined throughout the entire defensive perimeter. The situation could hardly have been more desperate. Dawn on June 8th brought an almost eerie quiet to Point du Hoc. German pressure had ceased completely, not because the enemy had given up their attack, but because they were obviously regrouping for what they assumed would be their final successful assault. The Rangers were almost completely out of ammunition and utterly exhausted from 2 days of continuous fighting. They prepared for what many believed might be their last stand against overwhelming enemy forces. Then, around noon, observers at Point du Hoc spotted movement to the east along the coastal highway. A column of troops was approaching their positions. For one terrible moment, the Rangers feared this was yet another German attack that they could not possibly repel. Then someone spotted the distinctive shape of American helmets through binoculars. Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion were approaching, accompanied by elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment. Tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion provided armored support for the relief column. The siege of Point du Hoc was finally over, after 2 days of desperate fighting. The relief force that reached Point du Hoc found a scene that shocked even veteran combat soldiers. The landscape had been cratered beyond all recognition by naval bombardment and artillery fire. The Rangers who emerged from their defensive positions were barely recognizable as human beings. They were covered completely in mud, blood, and cordite smoke from the fighting. Many were wounded, but still on their feet. All were utterly exhausted from the ordeal. When the reinforcements counted the survivors, the true cost of the mission became starkly clear. Of the original 225 Rangers who had landed on June 6th, only 90 remained able to fight. The casualty rate exceeded 60%. But the mission objectives had been completely accomplished despite this terrible price. The guns were destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. The coastal highway remained cut and under American control. German forces had been prevented from moving reinforcements between the beaches during the critical hours when the invasion's success hung in the balance. The Rangers had held their assigned positions for 2 full days against overwhelming enemy odds. They had demonstrated a level of determination and tactical skill that redefined what military planners thought was possible for such a small force. The strategic impact of the Point du Hoc assault extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives that had been achieved. The destruction of the 6 155 mm howitzers eliminated an artillery battery that could have caused devastating casualties on both Utah and Omaha beaches. Fire control officers later estimated that those 6 guns, if they had remained operational and properly directed, could have sunk or seriously damaged dozens of landing craft. Thousands of American soldiers might have been killed on the beaches during the most vulnerable hours of the invasion. The cutting and holding of the coastal highway prevented German mobile reserves from reinforcing either beach at the precise moment when such reinforcement might have driven the Allied forces back into the sea. The 914th Grenadier Regiment, committed to counterattacking Point du Hoc, was completely unavailable to counterattack at Omaha Beach. The outcome at Omaha remained in serious doubt until late afternoon on June 6th. If German reserves had been available to reinforce that sector, the results could have been catastrophic for the entire invasion. The Point du Hoc assault completely validated General Eisenhower's faith in specialized forces and innovative tactics over purely conventional military approaches. In his memoirs, published in 1948, Eisenhower wrote specifically about Point du Hoc and its significance. The Rangers who scaled those cliffs demonstrated the warrior spirit that would carry us to victory. They proved that courage and initiative could overcome material disadvantage. Training and determination could defeat seemingly superior defensive positions. General Omar Bradley was even more direct about the assault's significance in his memoir published in 1951. No soldier in my command has ever been assigned a more difficult task than that which befell the 34-year-old commander of the Provisional Ranger Force. That Rudder's Rangers were able to accomplish their mission was not merely a tactical success. It was a demonstration of the American soldier's capability to execute the impossible when properly led and motivated. The Rangers themselves remained characteristically modest about their extraordinary achievement. In oral histories recorded many decades later, survivors consistently emphasized teamwork, intensive training, and simple luck over individual heroism or exceptional courage. First Sergeant Lommel received the Distinguished Service Cross, the British Military Medal, and the French Legion of Honor for his destruction of the German guns. He always insisted that any ranger in the battalion could have accomplished exactly what he did. "We were all trained specifically for that exact mission," he said in a 1999 interview conducted 55 years after the battle. Jack Cohen provided covering fire for my approach. Other Rangers established the roadblock position that allowed us to move inland safely. Naval gunfire support kept the Germans from organizing effective counterattacks during the critical hours. It was never one man's individual achievement, but rather a battalion's collective achievement. We lost far too many good men for any of us to take personal pride in individual awards or recognition. The physical landscape of Point du Hoc remains virtually unchanged today, carefully preserved as a memorial to the Rangers who fought and died there. The massive craters from the naval bombardment still pockmark the ground like giant scars. The shattered concrete bunkers and gun casemates stand exactly as they were left after the battle. The cliff face itself bears permanent scars from that June morning when Rangers scaled its heights under enemy fire. At the cliff edge, memorials honor both the Rangers who climbed these cliffs and the men of all nations who fought and died on D-Day throughout Normandy. On June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan visited Point du Hoc for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. 62 survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who had climbed those cliffs sat in the audience as Reagan delivered one of his most memorable and moving speeches. Standing at the very edge of the cliff, Reagan spoke directly to the aging Rangers before him. "These are the boys of Point du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The strategic lessons learned from Point du Hoc extended far beyond June 1944 and influenced military thinking for decades afterward. The assault completely validated the concept of specialized training for specific missions. It proved conclusively that properly prepared forces could accomplish objectives that conventional forces simply could not achieve. The U.S. Army Ranger concept became a permanent and integral part of American military structure following World War II. Today's 75th Ranger Regiment traces its direct lineage to the 2nd Ranger Battalion and considers Point du Hoc a defining moment in Ranger history and tradition. The tactical innovations developed specifically for the Point du Hoc assault influenced military doctrine and special operations planning for many decades. The combination of specialized equipment, intensive training, and innovative tactics became a model for future operations. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Point du Hoc was neither tactical nor technological, but fundamentally human in nature. The assault demonstrated conclusively that properly motivated soldiers, given clear objectives and adequate training, could overcome obstacles that initially appeared completely insurmountable. The 1985 reunion of Point du Hoc veterans held at Fort Hood, Texas, brought together more than 500 former Rangers, many accompanied by their families and grandchildren. These men, now in their 60s, had not seen each other in many decades, but the bonds forged on that clifftop proved absolutely unbreakable. Colonel James Earl Rudder had died in 1970, having served with distinction as president of Texas A&M University and as Texas Land Commissioner after the war ended. His widow, Margaret Rudder, attended the reunion and spoke eloquently on his behalf. Jim never talked much about Point du Hoc at home, she told the assembled Rangers with obvious emotion. But I know he was tremendously proud of what you all accomplished together. He was deeply humbled by the memory of the men he lost. He used to say quietly that the real heroes were the ones who never came home. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, then 65 years old, delivered a keynote address that perfectly captured the essence of what the Rangers had learned through their ordeal. We approached Point du Hoc believing we faced a completely impossible mission. The Germans believed it was impossible too, and that supreme confidence became their fundamental weakness. They simply could not conceive that anyone would attempt what we were attempting. Therefore, they were not fully prepared for our success when it came. We learned that day that impossible is often just another word for extremely difficult. Difficult is just another word for requiring more courage and determination than your enemy expects you to possess. The statistical record of Point du Hoc tells a story that numbers alone cannot fully capture or convey. Of the 225 Rangers who landed on June 6th, approximately 135 were killed or wounded during the two-day battle. This casualty rate exceeded 60%, among the highest suffered by any unit during the entire D-Day operation. The Rangers maintained their positions for approximately 48 hours before relief arrived. They remained isolated and completely surrounded while defending against enemy forces estimated at battalion to regimental strength throughout this period. The 6 155mm guns were completely destroyed, approximately 3 hours after the initial landing. The primary mission objective was accomplished despite the discovery that the guns had been relocated from their expected positions. The entire mission was ultimately accomplished by just 2 men using thermite grenades. This demonstrated clearly that strategic military impact does not always correlate directly with the size of the force employed. The coastal highway was successfully cut and held throughout the critical period. Not a single American or Allied landing craft or naval vessel was struck by artillery fire from Point du Hoc's guns on June 6th. This completely validated the mission's strategic necessity. The human cost of Point du Hoc extended well beyond the battle itself. Many Rangers who survived the clifftop fighting were subsequently killed in later operations throughout the European campaign. The 2nd Ranger Battalion continued fighting through France and into Germany itself. They participated in the brutal Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where casualties were again devastating. Of the 90 Rangers who remained combat effective on June 8th, fewer than 40 survived the entire war without serious wounds. The legacy of Point du Hoc extends directly to every modern special operations unit in the American military. The 75th Ranger Regiment maintains a permanent memorial to Point du Hoc at its headquarters facility. Every Ranger training class visits Normandy as an integral part of their professional military education. They stand at the cliff edge, looking down at the beach below, trying to comprehend what their predecessors accomplished. The Ranger Creed includes the fundamental principle: I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. This principle was forged and tested at Point du Hoc, where Rangers repeatedly risked their own lives to recover wounded comrades under intense enemy fire. For the German defenders, Point du Hoc represented the beginning of the end of their Atlantic Wall defenses. This defensive system had consumed enormous resources and massive amounts of forced labor over several years of construction. The Atlantic Wall had been breached at one of its strongest points by a relatively small force using innovative tactics. The psychological impact on German defenders throughout the entire Normandy sector was significant and lasting. The 332nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, which had been responsible for defending the Normandy coastal sector, were completely shattered in the days immediately following June 6th. By the end of June 1944, both divisions had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The broader impact of Point du Hoc on the entire course of World War II cannot be overstated. D-Day succeeded largely because individual operations like Point du Hoc succeeded when success seemed impossible. If the Rangers had failed in their mission, if those 6 artillery pieces had remained operational and properly directed against the beaches, the outcome at Omaha Beach might have been catastrophically different for the Allied forces. The commemoration of Point du Hoc has evolved significantly over the decades since 1944. In 1979, the French government formally transferred Point du Hoc to the American Battle Monuments Commission for Perpetual Care and Maintenance as a memorial site. Today, Point du Hoc receives more than 400,000 visitors annually from around the world. The memorial site serves as both a tourist destination and an important educational facility for understanding D-Day's significance. The memorial at Point du Hoc is intentionally simple, but tremendously powerful in its impact. A granite pylon stands positioned atop a shattered German concrete bunker. Bronze tablets are inscribed in both French and English languages. The English inscription reads, "Here on June 6, 1944, elements of the United States 2nd Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, scaled these 100-foot cliffs and destroyed the German artillery battery that could have devastated the Allied landings at Omaha and Utah beaches." In conclusion, the assault on Point du Hoc stands as one of the supreme examples of military courage and tactical innovation during the entire Second World War. The mission succeeded ultimately because it was executed by men who simply refused to accept the possibility of failure. The German defenders were absolutely correct in their professional military assessment that the cliffs were nearly impregnable when attacked from the sea. However, they failed completely to account for the specialized training, absolute determination, and superior tactical skill of the Rangers who climbed them. The Rangers were correct in their confidence that they could accomplish their seemingly impossible mission, though the final cost in human lives was far higher than anyone had hoped or anticipated. The 6 guns were destroyed beyond repair. The coastal highway was cut and held. The invasion succeeded. But that success was purchased with the blood of 135 men killed or wounded. The transformation from impossible to difficult to accomplished represents the complete story of Point du Hoc. It began with a German defensive position that appeared absolutely unassailable to conventional military thinking. It continued with American military planners who refused to accept that unassailable necessarily meant impossible to overcome. It reached its climax with 225 rangers who climbed 100 feet of sheer rock under intense enemy fire because they had been specifically trained to accomplish exactly that mission, and because their assigned mission demanded nothing less. The Rangers who survived Point du Hoc went on to lead varied and productive civilian lives after the war ended. But they never forgot their fallen comrades who remained in Normandy's soil. As the decades passed and the number of survivors steadily dwindled, those who remained felt an increasing personal responsibility to ensure that the story of Point du Hoc would never be forgotten by future generations. The final chapter of the Point du Hoc story continues being written even now, decades after the battle. The cliffs remain standing as they always have. The memorial continues to honor those who fought. The story endures of 225 men who proved beyond any doubt that with proper training, absolute courage, and unwavering determination, there is no defensive position that cannot be taken, no cliff that cannot be climbed, and no military objective that cannot be achieved when freedom itself hangs in the balance.